Yeah. And part of the challenge there is that a lot of this management has been very manual in nature. We've had to try to hunt things down and try to track down bills or specific unit use costs or the discount from the contract and finding who actually signed the contract in the first place. So all sorts of things like that. But there recently, you pointed out before this chat that this company called ScienceLogic had an interesting post around autonomic IT, the idea that we would be able to automate a lot more of this stuff. And that feels like an interesting perspective, being able to automate a lot of what you're seeing from a transactional perspective, maybe meaning that a lot of this financial management becomes a little bit easier to track, as well as looking at observability, performance, service orders, all of that other stuff. So I'm interested in your take.
Yeah, well, it was interesting from a few different sort of points of view. I followed ScienceLogic for a long time. I'm a fan
Mhm.
of their general approach. I think they've got some really good tech. Um, to a certain extent, this was a branding exercise, meaning I think this was a blog post from their CTO that put this out there, and it's really just sort of a new term. But I like the term. I like that, because it sort of bundles together a whole bunch of things we've talked about in the past, where we've talked about blackout operations or self-healing networks and all these different things. And the basic premise
Mhm.
is that, sort of like we were just talking about, that we may finally now be at a point where we have enough intelligence that we can apply through AI and other forms of
Mhm.
algorithms and intelligence, that we could actually create this system that sort of takes on its own, takes its own management under its own power. And that's the idea. So, they're linking to this idea of the autonomic nervous system, which is, the thing that regulates our respiratory and our heart rate, and a lot of things. Some things we can control to a degree, some things that happen automatically. But the idea is this sort of self-regulating system, and it's this sort of interesting concept if you apply it into IT, that says, hey, you have this environment that you sort of turn on, put this layer of intelligence, and it sort of runs itself. Kind of interesting. What was probably more interesting, though, is that, looking at their website, it didn't seem to be linked to like an actual product announcement. So they're using some of the
Mhm.
terminology, but I don't see them really going to market saying we can deliver this today. So it was almost like this aspirational view. It's not an entirely new concept. BMC started talking about what they call the autonomous enterprise a couple of years ago. There's been talk about this for a while, but I think, can anyone bring it to fruition? Do we want it to? That's the bigger question, right? I mean, if I put myself back in the seat, would I actually trust a system to run in that way? I'm not
Mhm.
sure I would. I'm not sure I would today.
Yeah.
So, those are some of the things.
I always am a little doubtful anytime I hear a comparison to a biological system. So I studied biochemistry in college. I have some idea of how this stuff works, even though it's been, probably 25 years since I really cracked open a textbook. But I like when I think about something like an autonomous biological system. I think of there are things that are just kind of happening in the background, much like when you turn on the power always turns on when you switch on the lights, unless something really bad happens. And then you have kind of these autonomous things that are happening, signals that you're not thinking about, your heart rate, things like that. But you also have to have the reactive systems that actually act with the outside world. Those are your alerts. Those are the rapid responses. That's what keeps you from, burning yourself when you try to put your hand in the fire, or fight or flight. All those types of things. And you have to have each of those levels basically defined at a business level or an IT level to be able to figure this out. So you might say, your base level are kind of these workloads that are mission critical, but also extremely stable, that you don't even think about. The only question is that server on, and is that power is that power actually on? Whereas I think this autonomous level it starts getting a little tricky, because you have to figure out which of these things would you actually trust to automate, and how many nines are you going to put on it? The 4 nines, 5 nines, 6 nines of uptime. What level of autonomy actually goes there? Because the dirty truth is that even with our own human autonomous systems, like we have breaks that are probably bigger than we would expect. We have little murmurs within our heartbeats that we don't like to think about, but that they do happen. And if they happened at an enterprise IT perspective, it might not be considered acceptable. Like that's the actual truth of getting to an autonomous IT.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fundamental challenge that I've always had with the entire premise and concept is, well, I think we can probably agree that if you deploy something into operation, you don't want it to break. Okay, great. If we can have something that can remediate itself so it doesn't break, keeps operating at some stasis level, that's fine. But to say it's fully, and whether you call it autonomous or whatever term you want to use, it implies a business context, because these systems don't exist just to run, right?
Mhm.
They exist to serve a business purpose, and that is linked to the specific goals and objectives that are dynamic, that are changing constantly. And so having this idea that you just turn it on, let it run, it sort of runs counter to the entire reason we
Mhm.
build these things to begin with. And so, I think that it's one of those things that sounds really interesting, but I think that and I get where they're going, but I think that there's a lot of other elements. And the reality is, you've got to nail it. You've got to have a clear understanding, if you're selling into the enterprise, of what it is, what problems they're trying to solve, and what they're
Mhm.
trying to do. And I think is a good way to sort of wrap up our conversation. We can talk about one of those that was a big miss this week, and that is that Meta finally announced that they have sunset the workplace product. And I say finally because I honestly thought it was sunset years ago. So
Mhm.
if you're not even aware of it, this was sort of their attempt to compete with Slack or Teams, and it was basically Facebook for the enterprise, and it never got any traction. And as far as according to the announcement, they're going to continue to use it internally, but they just never were plugged into what the enterprise really really needed. And so I saw this news come across, and it's like, how about that? I didn't even know it was still running.
Mhm. And at
Yeah.
a time when Slack, Teams, Atlassian, all sorts of companies made hay, creating the next work social network, all of those had some level of success. But yeah, Meta Workplace never went anywhere. And it, I think it's always been hard because Meta slash Facebook always made its money off of basically being a spy. We all know that Facebook has access to all of your data. They are unrepentant about that on the consumer side. They collect information that practically every other company, even say the Googles of the world, would consider off limits because it was just part of the model. It was just part of the business model. So trying to flip from that to suddenly say that you would be trusted in a business context was just a super hard sell. I think that was just a fundamental misalignment between the company brand and then this proposed product, which I guess technically launched, but never really got any serious market traction. I think it's important for companies to realize once you have a brand, once you make certain commitments, positive or negative, that actually does define what you can do from a product perspective. No, even if you're a Meta, even if you're a $1 trillion company, you can't just throw out whatever you want and expect people to adopt it.